In the dimly lit control room of the Galactic Communications Nexus, Tevra stared at the blinking red light on her console. The gentle hum of machinery surrounded her, but the urgency of that light, flashing in steady, rhythmic beats, drowned out everything else. Her hands hovered above the console, hesitating. For years, she had trained for emergencies, yet nothing had prepared her for this. An SOS of this level hadn't been received in decades, and she knew the implications of responding. Tevra, a sharp voice broke her trance. Chief Arvin, her superior, stood at the doorway, his expression carved with tension. His gray-tinted scales shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. "What's the situation?" "It's from the colony on Veteran 3, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "They're under attack. The message is fragmented, but it's clear they've lost their defenses." Arvin's jaw tightened. Veteran 3 wasn't just any colony. It was a key outpost in the Alliance's border systems, home to over 1 million inhabitants and a critical resource hub. If it fell, it would be a devastating blow to the Alliance's strength and morale. Tevra replayed the transmission, her voice softening as distorted screams and explosions filled the air. The message's ending crackled with desperation. "No one else can. They're everywhere. Please send the Deathworlders." The room fell silent. Arvin's eyes flickered with unease. "They want the Deathworlders," he murmured, almost to himself. The word hung in the air like a ghost, evoking equal parts dread and fascination. Deathworlders, the most feared and enigmatic species in the galaxy. Born on a planet so hostile that its very existence defied logic, they were survivors beyond compare, warriors without equal. But they were also outsiders, cut off from the rest of galactic society by mutual agreement and fear. "Chief," Tevra began, her throat dry. "If we don't respond, Veteran 3 is lost. And if we do," she trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Summoning the Deathworlders was a gamble with stakes too high to measure. Their power was undeniable, but so was the risk of unleashing them. Arvin's gaze shifted to the other officers who had gathered in the control room, their faces mirroring his conflicted thoughts. Finally, he turned back to Tevra. "Patch me into the council. They need to hear this." Minutes later, the holographic forms of the Alliance's leaders materialized in the center of the room. Representatives from the core worlds, each bearing the distinct features of their species, filled the space with a cacophony of overlapping voices. The debate ignited instantly. "We cannot involve the Deathworlders," declared Minister Lethos, his plumage bristling with indignation. "Their intervention would destabilize everything we have worked for. Their methods are barbaric." "Barbaric or not," countered General Vren, her metallic prosthetics gleaming as she gestured emphatically, "we're out of options. Veteran 3 is falling, and our fleets are too far to intervene. This is exactly why the Deathworlders were left in reserve." "Reserve?" Lethos scoffed. "We've kept them at arm's length because we've seen what they're capable of. Once they're unleashed, how do we ensure they don't turn on us?" The argument swirled, voices rising and falling, each carrying a blend of logic and fear. Tevra watched in silence, her heart pounding. Her gaze drifted to the console, where the flashing SOS persisted. In that relentless pulse, she could almost hear the cries of those on Veteran 3. Families, children, all counting on someone to save them. Finally, Arvin raised his hand, commanding the room's attention. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is not a decision to be made lightly, but we cannot ignore the urgency of this situation. Tevra, you received the signal. What is your recommendation?" The weight of every gaze in the room fell on her. For a moment, she froze. What could she say? That she understood the Council's fears? That she shared them? None of that would change the reality of Veteran 3's plight. "We have no choice," she said finally, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. "If we don't act now, we'll lose more than Veteran 3. We'll lose faith in ourselves in this alliance. And the Deathworlders, they may be our only hope." Arvin nodded solemnly. "Then it's decided." The council members murmured their reluctant agreement, though the tension in their expressions remained. as the holograms flickered out one by one. The room seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight of the decision settling over everyone present. Tevra turned back to her console. Her fingers trembled as she entered the override codes, bypassing the ancient protocols that had locked the Deathworlder's coordinates away for centuries. A shiver ran down her spine as the connection established, and the screen filled with unfamiliar symbols. The Deathworlder's language was jagged and unyielding, much like the beings themselves. "Message transmitted," she said quietly, leaning back in her chair. The red light stopped blinking. In its place was an ominous silence, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Hours passed with no response. Tevra remained at her post, her thoughts churning. She had always prided herself on being calm under pressure, but this was different. The uncertainty was suffocating. What if they didn't come? What if they did? She couldn't decide which possibility scared her more. Then, the console beeped, a single, piercing tone that shattered the stillness. The screen came to life, and for the first time, Tevra saw them. The Deathworlders. Their leader's face filled the monitor, angular and scarred, with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through her. His voice was low and resonant, each word carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. "We receive your signal," he said. "Prepare your people. The fleet is on its way." The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Tevra staring at the blank screen. The room was deathly quiet. Arvin placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "You've done your part," he said, though his voice carried no reassurance. "Now we wait." Tevra nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Somewhere out in the void, the Deathworlders were coming. And with them, the fate of Vedran 3, and perhaps the entire galaxy, hung in the balance. The silence of space was shattered as the Deathworlder fleet emerged from hyperspace, their vessels tearing into existence with an almost predatory grace. Tevra had never seen ships like these before. Sleek and angular, they glinted in the dim light of Vedran 3's sun, their hulls bristling with weaponry that seemed more organic than mechanical. A dark, primal part of her stirred at the sight. These weren't just tools of war. They were apex predators designed to dominate. The communications feed crackled to life. "This is Fleet Commander Kareth of the Deathworlder vessel Bloodspire. Vedran 3, hold position and relay tactical data immediately. Do not interfere." His tone left no room for argument. Tevra watched as the colony's faint transmissions blinked weakly on her monitor, the desperation in their reports a stark contrast to Kareth's cold efficiency. "They're here," she murmured, barely aware of the words. The control room's tension was palpable, each officer frozen in place, as if the mere act of breathing might disrupt the fragile balance of power now in play. "And they don't waste time," Arvin muttered beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Despite his composed exterior, Tevra could see the way his claws tapped against his sleeve, betraying his unease. On the screen, the Deathworlder ships began to move. Their fleet was smaller than the Alliance's, but it didn't matter. Tevra could tell just by watching them that these vessels were built for efficiency, every detail engineered for battle. As the first enemy vessels, hulking, insectoid things, descended on Vedran 3, the Deathworlders struck. It was chaos. The Deathworlder ships moved like predators on a hunt, darting between enemy formations with impossible agility. Their weapons discharged in bursts of searing light, each shot calculated to cripple or destroy. Tevra's console lit up with data feeds as the Alliance sensors struggled to keep up. Her fingers flew across the controls, desperate to make sense of the unfolding battle. The insectoid ships counterattacked, their beams of green energy slicing through the void. But the Deathworlders seemed to anticipate every move. One enemy cruiser veered towards the Bloodspire, its energy cannons charging. Before it could fire, a smaller Deathworlder ship darted into its path, discharging a payload that detonated with blinding intensity. When the light faded, the enemy vessel was gone. "They're dissecting them," Arvin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tevra nodded, unable to tear her eyes from the screen. It was true. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting. They were dismantling the enemy, exploiting weaknesses with surgical precision. It was terrifying and mesmerizing in equal measure. The feed shifted, showing the colony's surface. Fires raged across Veteran 3's settlements, the remnants of the planetary defense systems lying in smoldering ruins. Civilians huddled in makeshift shelters as insectoid drones swarmed through the streets. Tevra's stomach twisted. Even with the Deathworlder's intervention, it might already be too late. "Fleet Commander Kareth," she said, activating the communication link. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to steady it. "The colony it's in critical condition. Civilians are still trapped. Can you?" "Our priority is eliminating the threat," Kareth interrupted. His image appeared on her screen, his expression as unyielding as his voice. His scarred face was framed by a helmet that seemed more like an extension of his body than armor. "The colony's survival depends on us neutralizing these invaders. Do not question our methods." The transmission ended, leaving Tevra staring at the blank screen. She felt a surge of frustration, but Arvin's hand on her shoulder stopped her from voicing it. "They know what they're doing," he said quietly. "We have to trust them." Trust. The word tasted bitter. But as Tevra looked back at the battle, she couldn't deny that the Deathworlders were accomplishing what no one else could. The enemy fleet was breaking, their formations crumbling under the relentless assault. The Bloodspire's main cannons fired, and an enemy dreadnought, the largest vessel in the invaders' armada, shattered in a cascade of explosions. It was over in minutes. The remaining insectoid ships scattered, fleeing into hyperspace. The Deathworlder fleet didn't pursue. Instead, they turned their attention to the colony. Smaller vessels detached from the larger ships, descending to the planet's surface. Tevra's monitor displayed their movements as they landed near the most devastated areas. "What are they doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Search and rescue," Arvin said, his tone matching her astonishment. "They're helping." Tevra leaned closer to the screen, her eyes widening. The Deathworlders weren't just warriors. On the ground, their soldiers moved with the same efficiency they had shown in battle, pulling survivors from the rubble and tending to the injured. Their armor, imposing and alien, seemed almost gentle as they carried frightened children to safety. For a species so feared, their actions spoke of a deeper complexity. The communication link crackled again. This time it was one of the Deathworlder officers. "Veteran 3, this is Major Siren. Evacuation protocols are underway. Prepare your transports to receive civilians." Tevra blinked. "You're evacuating them?" "The colony is compromised," Siren replied, his voice calm but firm. "We'll stabilize the immediate threats, but this planet is no longer viable. Your people will need to relocate." The call ended, and Tevra sank back in her chair. Her emotions swirled. Relief for the survivors, sorrow for the loss of the colony, and a growing respect for the Deathworlders. They had come as destroyers, but they were leaving as saviors. It was a paradox she couldn't quite reconcile. "I didn't expect this," she admitted, glancing at Arvin. "None of us did," he replied. "But maybe that's the point. They're not what we thought they were." The fleet began to withdraw, the Bloodspire leading the way. As the Deathworlder ships disappeared into hyperspace, Tevra felt a strange emptiness. The threat was gone, but so were the beings who had saved them. The control room's usual hum returned, but it felt different now. Quieter, heavier. Tevra's console beeped, drawing her attention. A single message blinked on the screen, sent from the Bloodspire before its departure. "Remember this. Survival comes at a cost. Ensure it's worth paying." She stared at the words, their weight settling over her. The Deathworlders had done what they promised, but they had left something more profound in their wake. Questions. Challenges. A reminder that survival was not the same as victory. And as she looked out into the vast expanse of space, Tevra knew the galaxy would never view them, or itself, the same way again. The aftermath of the battle left Veteran 3 in a state of fragile quiet. The skies above were clear now. The remnants of the enemy fleet, nothing more than scattered debris drifting in orbit. Tevra remained at her station, staring at the report streaming across her monitor. The evacuation was progressing, though not without challenges. Thousands of survivors were being loaded onto Alliance transport ships, their faces etched with exhaustion and loss. Despite the chaos, there was an undeniable sense of relief. They were alive, something that had seemed impossible mere hours ago. "Any word from the Deathworlders?" Arvin asked, his voice low as he approached her console. His usual composure was frayed, the weight of the day's events visible in the slump of his shoulders. Tevra shook her head. "Nothing since they left. Just that final message." She hesitated, then added, "Do you think they'll come back?" Arvin's expression darkened. "I don't know. But if they do, it won't be for us. They've made their stance clear. They intervene only when the stakes demand it. Anything less isn't worth their attention." Her gaze dropped to the console. The Deathworlder's message still lingered in her mind, its blunt simplicity refusing to fade. "Survival comes at a cost. Ensure it's worth paying." It felt less like a statement and more like a warning, as if they had left behind a challenge rather than a parting gift. The room's main screen flickered, drawing everyone's attention. A live feed from one of the evacuation zones filled the display. The camera panned across rows of civilians waiting to board the transports, their belongings clutched tightly to their chests. Medics moved between them, administering aid where they could. In the background, the skeletal remains of the colony's infrastructure loomed, a stark reminder of all that had been lost. "Commander Tevra, we've got a situation," a voice crackled over the comms. It was one of the Alliance officers stationed on the surface. "Some of the evacuees are refusing to leave. They're saying they'd rather stay and rebuild." Tevra exchanged a look with Arvin. "Rebuild? After everything that's happened?" "It's their home," Arvin said quietly. "For some people, that's worth any risk." Tevra activated her comms. "Patch me through to the surface." Moments later, the feed split to show a small group of colonists standing defiantly in front of one of the transports. Their leader, a middle-aged woman with a bandaged arm, stepped forward. Her face was lined with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes burned with determination. "Commander," the woman began, her voice steady despite the situation. "We appreciate what the Alliance has done for us, but this is our world. We've built our lives here, and we're not going to abandon it." Tevra's mind raced. The colony was in ruins, its defenses obliterated. Staying behind wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. But she could see the resolve in their faces, the unyielding will that came from years of hardship. They had survived the invasion. Now they wanted to reclaim what was theirs. "I understand your feelings," Tevra said carefully, her tone measured. "But the planet is compromised. We can't guarantee your safety if the enemy returns." "And what's the alternative?" The woman shot back. "Drift from one Alliance outpost to another, never finding a place to call home? Veteran 3 is more than just a planet to us. It's our identity. If we leave now, we lose that forever." Arvin stepped forward, his presence commanding even through the screen. "What you're asking is noble," he said, "but noble intentions won't shield you from what's out there. You've seen what the enemy is capable of. Without proper defenses, staying here is a death sentence." The woman hesitated, her resolve faltering for a moment. But then she squared her shoulders. "If the Deathworlders can fight for what they believe in, so can we. We'll find a way to survive. That's what we do." Tevra felt a pang of admiration. These people had faced unimaginable horrors and still refused to give up. It was the same spirit she had seen in the Deathworlders, that unrelenting drive to endure no matter the odds. But admiration wasn't enough to change reality. "We can't stop them," she said quietly to Arvin. "If they're determined to stay, it's their choice." Arvin's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we give them what support we can. Supplies, medical equipment, anything that might improve their chances." Tevra relayed the decision to the surface, and the colonists' relief was palpable. As the Alliance transports began to lift off, taking the majority of the survivors to safety, those who remained behind gathered together, their determination a fragile beacon against the desolation around them. "Do you think they'll make it?" Tevra asked as the last of the transports disappeared into the atmosphere. "I don't know," Arvin admitted, "but they've earned the right to try." The control room grew quiet again, the weight of their decision settling over them. Tevra stared out at the stars, her thoughts drifting to the Deathworlders. They had shown the galaxy what true resilience looked like, but they had also left behind a question that would linger for years to come. What did it truly mean to survive? As Veteran 3 faded from view, Tevra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Deathworlders had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and the galaxy would have to find its way through, together or apart. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same.